Hello, and welcome to the second week of this 4-week course. And that brings us to Paracelsus. So, as you can see, that was not his given name. He was born Theophrastus Bombast of Hohenheim. And I thought I would start with a short introduction to lead over from last time. We heard that Éliphas Lévi really paid attention to correspondences, and that's how he connected the Tarot with the Hebrew alphabet. And with Paracelsus, the distinguishing feature is his view of cosmology, theology, natural philosophy, and medicine in the light of analogies and correspondences between microcosm and macrocosm. And that's extremely important to remember. And there were speculations about this before, but he was the very first person to apply it systematically to the knowledge of nature. This is one thing we should remember during this talk. And then he said, if man, the climax of creation, unites in himself all the constituents of the world surrounding him, minerals, plants, animals, and celestial bodies, he can acquire knowledge much more direct and internal. And he said it's the astral body that teaches man. And we talked about the astral body and the astral light last time. But what he means is we need to know also the internal man. So why, as a Theosophist, would you want to learn more about Paracelsus? Well, first of all, because HBB mentioned her often in her writings. And she said he was the most wondrous intellect of his age and original thinker. But he was one of the most fascinating but also enigmatic figures in history. And he was open to new and nature-compliant healing approaches and was regarded as a reformer of medical practice. So even if you're not a Theosophist, it is very helpful to know something about Paracelsus. And what is the quality that I really admired in him? Well, he was a fantastic observer. And he had the ability to deduce from his observations and trust his intuitions. He was really outstanding. This was an outstanding quality. So who was he? He was a Swiss physician, a philosopher of nature, an alchemist, a lay theologian, and an occultist. He was an original and prolific author of 16th century Europe. And his writings covered medicine, surgery, natural philosophy, alchemy, astronomy, natural magic, and Reformation theology. And on the left, you see the 1540 portrait by Hirschvogel. So he was born most likely on November 14th, 1493. Before I continue, I want to say something. We have touched upon this last time. So biographers can be sympathetic to the object of their research or less sympathetic. But with Paracelsus, it was really complicated because he had, first of all, he had people who hated him. Some of the writings are venomous, really hurtful. And then he had biographers who focused exclusively on his medical discoveries, but they did not want to deal with anything that sounded too outworldly to them. And some people think he was born later in December, but I feel he probably was a Scorpio because the Scorpio has a magnetic attraction to spiritual and magical operations. He has a highly transformative and intense will. And when he is stressed, he becomes upset, he becomes obstinate. Anyhow, he was born in Maria Einsiedeln in Switzerland. And his parents were William of Hohenheim, an illegitimate offspring of the noble Bombast of Hohenheim from Swabia. He was a physician, and most people say his mother was a bondswoman. The interesting thing is, so his father, William's grandfather, was a nobleman, but he had a temper. And he sometimes got into altercations and had to show up in front of the courts. Paracelsus' mother suffered from depression. And when Paracelsus was probably around 7 years old, she committed suicide by jumping off the Teufelsbrücke, that's the Devil's Bridge. That was a bridge very close to where Paracelsus was born. And based on that experience, he was only a child. He later on said that mentally ill people should be treated with compassion and not harshly. Anyhow, there was some altercation again with Paracelsus' grandfather. So his dad, William, decided to leave town with Paracelsus. Probably around 1502, they arrived in Villach, or Villach, in Carinthia. So that's in today's Austria. It's in the south of Austria. But back then, when you traveled for a long time. And it probably was for about 2 years took them to go from Einsiedeln to Villach. And got a taste for traveling and learned a lot. In Villach, William was a town physician, worked as a town physician, was respected. And he also worked as a teacher in the mining school. Now, Williams had some curious books, interesting books. And because of that, he was open-minded. He taught Paracelsus, even when he was young, alchemy, botany, herbs, and their relation to stars. He also learned something about metallurgy and even medicine. How is this possible? Well, let's look at the historical background. There was a huge transition from the 15th to the 16th century. The church had always said that the earth was flat. But then Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, they came back from their trips. And based on their reports, it was clear that the earth was not flat, that it was actually a globe. This was very embarrassing for the church. But people back then still had to be very careful what they wrote and what they said because of the Inquisition. But in the end, Europe changed and people demanded the right to think for oneself. And they reached out into new fields and untried fields. The church was not the institution, the organization anymore that had the absolute knowledge. And in addition, universities started popping up in different countries. And there they could get a different kind of education. So he was still a boy when they arrived in Villach. And in the monastery of St. Paul, there were Benedictine fathers and got education from them. One of them I wanted to mention because his name was Bishop Erhard. He was open-minded. He wasn't dogmatic. He didn't think that Latin was the most important thing to learn, and even encouraged Paracelsus in the way he saw it and his interest in the Philosopher's Stone. He also learned a lot in Sigmund Früh's silver mines and laboratories. He worked there for a while, and he learned a lot about the chemical and metallurgical processes. And it's not clear if it was 1507 or 1509, but eventually he decided to search for more potent truths, and he went on a trip and decided to travel. So on this trip, according to most biographers, he met Johannes Trithemius. He was a German Benedictine abbot. He was a polymath and an occultist. And Paracelsus learned a lot from him. He learned also that hidden forces of nature should be known and used, and that God desired man to attain such knowledge. I want to say a little bit about the minds of Früh. Sigmund Früh must have been a very nice man. Paracelsus worked for him, but he worked with the miners, right? And that's when all his personal observations started to really come in. And another quality he had is he listened. It didn't matter if somebody was a bishop or if it was a miner or a gypsy. He listened to everyone. And the miners shared old folklore and curious beliefs. And so he learned a lot through observation and by listening to the stories about minerals. And that minerals, like plants and animals, are born, grow, decrease with age, and die. and that all bodies seem to have their roots in atmosphere or space. So for him, minerals were not dead matter. He also realized that they must derive nutrition from an invisible field of substance. And that was an important discovery for him. And later on, he wrote on the miners' sickness and other diseases of miners. So he learned really a lot during that time. So he continued again from 1512 to 1517. So he attended different universities. He might have gotten a bachelor's degree at the University of in Vienna, Austria, today's Austria. He went to German, French, and Italian universities. He was not overly impressed what he learned there. But even in the end, he got a doctorate in medicine at the University of Ferrara. Now, his enemies said he might not have even gotten a doctorate there. It might have been 1515, 1517. And during that time, it is said he took on the name Paracelsus. It is not clear if he picked that name or if somebody else decided on that name, maybe his friends or colleagues from university. And there is even different opinions about what it means. When you read German biographies, they sometimes say it's a translation of the name Hohenheim, mixed Greek and Latin. But most people say that it's Paracelsus, para, better than Celsus. And Celsus was a Roman philosopher who wrote a lot about medicine, lived around 100 BC. And then his great peregrination started. He went to basically from one end to Europe to the other end of Europe, right? And he learned a lot on these trips from all kinds of people, but he also looked at the plants. He was very interested in the herbs. Supposedly, he was captured by the Tartars and learned a lot from them, and they respected him, even though he was a prisoner. It is not known how and when he escaped. And he also it is said that he made it to Egypt. He worked as an army surgeon for different armies. So I had read about for the Dutch, for the army of the Netherlands or Italian armies, and he learned a lot of useful information. But he treated the treatments of the wounded soldiers was very different than all the other army surgeons. For example, he would take the bandages that were very bloody, and he would treat them with a certain substance, which he thought was too strong to put directly on a limb, and tried to help hasten the healing process. And that all had to do with the astral light and the astral body, because he believed that there is the astral body, and that when you treat that astral body, you can help the healing of the physical body. For example, he would make sometimes of limbs a copy out of wax and treated it that way. He also, during the time, they amputated the limbs, and then people would say they still felt pain. And there was one soldier that he said he just was really suffering, and he felt like there was a nail in this limb that didn't exist anymore. They knew where they had buried that limb, and they opened it. It was in a box, in a wooden box, and the nail had gone through the wooden box into that what they thought dead limb. And when they removed that nail, the pain stopped. So that taught him a lot. But of course, he was ridiculed by his colleagues. I don't know how to say that in English properly. Maybe Azot, and maybe some of you have heard of it. There is another picture of a Paracelsus, and you can see here, look at my mouse, that he has a sword in his hand, and he was known to always travel with his sword and to sleep with it. And sometimes people say he worked for hours and then he just fell into bed with his clothes on, but the sword was with him. And this Azov is considered to be a universal medication or universal solvent and was sought for in alchemy. It's the sublimated essence of spirit. That's what it's called. And if you look closer, you can see here the pommel of the sword. And it was said that in the sword's hollow pommel, he kept this miraculous powder, which was capable of transmuting metals, healing diseases, transporting bodies from one place to another, astral travel, right? I have heard this in two places. The legend is that he went to Egypt. He was in Constantinople then, and he met there Solomon Prismosinos, who was a very advanced soul, and maybe he gave him the powder or taught him how to produce that powder. The next stations, he finally decided to settle down. And he ended up in Salzburg. So Salzburg in today's Austria in 1524. He was very admired there, but mostly by the poor people. He always treated poor people. He charged the people who were well off, got money from them, but he was willing to help anybody. Unfortunately, there was the Bauernkrieg, the Peasants' War during that time. And supposedly he was either encouraging the peasants or helped them to be. It is not quite clear. But it is known, and it's a fact, that he had to flee, basically overnight, because of the way he had supported them. So he went on to Strasbourg. And there he ended up in 1526, and he gained citizenship there, and he joined the Surgeons Guild. During that time, he wrote about the Virgin Mary, the Holy Trinity, and he criticized the church. He didn't really get much into Luther. I mean, he was supported him, but there was also a situation at one point where Luther didn't help people that Paracelsus thought he should have helped. In Switzerland, Zwingli became big. So he kept out of it, but he had his own opinion. In effect, he was a very, very devout Christian. For him, the faith or the belief in God was very big part of his life. He said, everything that happens takes place through the will of the Supreme. Conscience is the state which we have received from God, in which we should see our own image, and according to the dictates of which we should act, without attempting to discover reasons and the guidance of our life in regard to morals and virtues. We should do that which our conscience teaches, for no other reason but because our conscience teaches it. Still, he was an enemy of hypocrisy. He really had problems with that. So he grasped the divine in the process of becoming. There is an eternal happening, and man is one link in this eternal happening. So he gave man a very important role in this world. And he ascribed to man a self-creative activity. But he always emphasized the importance of self-knowledge, of independent thinking. He said man is a co-architect in the creation of the universe. He can become an alchemist. That means he has to change. And when he talks about alchemists, of course, there's the alchemy where you change metal into gold. But it's about alchemy, about the changing, evolving as a human being, purifying yourself. So here we reach the climax of his career. So Johannes Verb was a very well-known printer during that time. And he had some illness. He couldn't get any help. So he reached out to Paracelsus and he asked him if he would come and visit him and prescribe a treatment, which Paracelsus did. And it worked. And so Johannes Verb was very impressed with him, and he was influential. And based on this influence, Paracelsus was appointed town physician and lecturer to the city and University of Basel. But when he came to lectures and everything else, he broke with practically every traditional concept. I listened recently to a lecture by Manly Hall, or more than one, about Paracelsus. And his interpretation was he could have become, he could have enjoyed his position, he could have gone along, but he didn't, right? First of all these professors there were always well dressed, and he didn't go along. He said, I am dressed the way I am, that's not important. Second of all, he taught in German. He refused to teach in Latin. One other thing, for example, there's one story I share because it's so interesting. So one day he invited his colleagues, and then he had a silver bowl, and then he opened it and said, do you know what this is? These are my excrements. And then, they were all shocked and disgusted. But he said, we have to learn from that. And for us today, in the 21st century, that's completely normal. We know how physicians sometimes try to find a problem. Another thing he did, he told his students that they have to learn a lot about herbs, right? They have to go out with him and study those herbs, and that they should make their own medication, which made the apothecaries at that time very angry. But he said that they probably sell snake oil, that they don't even know what they're doing. It's very outspoken. So let's go back to this microcosm, because what I want to explain now is the different approach in medicine, why it is said that he started to reform medicine. So he always said that the forces composing the microcosm of man are identical with the forces composing the macrocosm of the world. And if you look in the great organism of the cosmos, these forces may act in an abnormal manner. And if that happens, then we have earthquakes, we have floods. But in the organism of man, these forces may act in an abnormal manner, and that leads to diseases or to outbursts. And back then, the belief was that that there were 4 humors that caused the illness. So let's look at that. So he was called the Luther of medicine. What happened? So the teachings were based on the books of Avicenna and Galen, mainly. And one day, I think it was the 24th of July, they were celebrating something, and they had a bonfire, and he walked by and he threw those books into the fire. So what was the issue he had? So Galen, based on Hipparchus, believed that the 4 humors play an important role. These are vital bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if there is a deficiency or an imbalance in those biles, that leads to illness. And Galen suggested that a moderate imbalance in the mixtures of this fluid produces also the temperament. So somebody is phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine, melancholic based on that. But this was the core issue here, is that the physicians at that time, and before, looked at the effects of an illness. They never looked at the cause. And that was the main problem for Paracelsus. So he said the 4 tempers are rooted in the body of man. And the body comes from the elements. The soul comes from the stars, and the spirit from God. And again, remember, always for him, it's analogy and correspondence. So the elements are an analogy to the temperaments embodied in the fluids. So he said, the body has 4 kinds of taste. And he explained, sour has the qualities cold and dry, which is melancholic. And that corresponds to the element earth. He always talked about the 4 elements: earth, fire, water, air. So if it's bitter, qualities are hot and dry. If this is emphasized, the person is choleric, and that is corresponds to the element fire. Sweet is cold and moist. Phlegmatic corresponds to the element water. And salty is hot and moist. Sanguine, which corresponds to the element air. For him, he said, of course, we all it's earth, fire, water, air, right? 4 elements were insufficient to express the invisible. And you cannot find the cause if you only look at the outer man. And he said there is a 5th element. He called it quinta essentia. And that is necessary for multiple dimension thinking. And he said that this element binds together in union the other 4 elements. It is the bridge between the material world and the realm of the spiritual. And it has within itself all of the other elements and therefore lives in all things, material and spiritual. So another thing, part that came into the way he looked at medicine, he was not a professional astrologer, but he said that all knowledge comes from the stars. He also said that whatever the stars can do, man can do himself. But the knowledge of the stars is intimately connected with medicine, with magic, and alchemy. So let's look at an example. So let's assume a person is angry. And they would say in the old days that it was because he has too much bile. But Paracelsus said, no, it's because the Mars, the combative element in his body, so the planet Mars represents the combativeness, assertiveness, is in a state of exaltation. And he said this is the invisible power that guides the production of bile. So this is the issue. It's not the bile, but that combative element. Or if somebody is amorous, it's not because his spermatic vessels are overloaded, but because the Venus, the amorous element in his body, is in a state of exaltation. Now, let's assume that you have the astrological chart and you have a conjunction. That means an overlap of those 2 planets, Mars and Venus. That can lead to jealousy. And that's something he has to overcome. And then on top of it, we have, and I don't want to read this because it's so, we have the astrological chart, we have the globe, and then we have transits. For example, we have now Pluto transiting Capricorn, and we have Jupiter and Saturn still conjunct transiting Aquarius. But let's say that Mars and Venus are in the chart, and there is a planet that conjuncts this conjunction. And that can lead to huge problems unless counteracted by the superior power of reason and will. So there are these influences. And if you remember last week, we talked about Éliphas Lévi, and he said the more evolved a human is, the more he can control these powers from the planets. So, but that's sometimes if somebody might commit crime out of jealousy, looking at the chart might be helpful. So this is it. He talked about the cause of disease. This is what the physicians need to know. And that they're different. So the ensia, so the essences, it can be the power and the nature of the stars and the influence on the body that the person cannot control, for example. Effects of toxins contained in food, in drugs, and even medicine, and the role of the excretory organs. He said a body can become confused because of wrong physical health habits. Already then, he said, what we eat, how much we eat, what we drink, how much we drink is very important. The diet is extremely important for men. The psychological causes that make our body sick. So he was, in that sense, a precursor for psychosomatic illnesses and psychological issues. And when you read about it, he says it's often an uncertainty of purpose. That means the person, we would express it in theosophical terms, hasn't found his or her dharma, right? What is the purpose of my life? And then he never addresses reincarnation. That was not something one could talk about during that time. But he talks about the disobedience to the laws of God. So about destiny and karma. And he emphasized that the human is responsible for his behavior and it could have negative effects if he doesn't do the right thing. And I thought just because this affects us right now, right? He doesn't talk about pandemics, but he does talk quite a bit about epidemics. And he said about epidemics that man is relatively powerless in curbing them unless caught early. He said that they appear and disappear suddenly, but he doesn't provide one single reason for an epidemic. He says it's due to mutations of the atmosphere, the configurations of planets, and broad psychic disturbances. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but they are caused by us, by humans, with the negative and destructive attitudes or negative emotions. And when it's many of them, then they create these artificial organisms and they can cause problems. And one thing that I find interesting too, he said was epidemics not to be fearful. He said he has observed that those who are less fearful less often become sick. He also talked about ways to get healthy, right? And the first one is the usual way of treatment. That's why it's in a different color. So he talks about treatment with opposite remedies, like cold by warmth, dryness by moisture. Then he said another option is employing specific remedies, of which it is known that they have certain affinities for certain morbid conditions. And the way he explains it, this is like a precursor to homeopathy. Then he says the physicians of this class, characterales, had the power to cure diseases by employing their willpower. And this is something we're going to talk about next time. One of them is magnetism, or he also talks about suggestion or mind cure. And then he also says the followers of spiritualists, the followers of this system had the power to employ spiritual forces. So basically that you figure out what your purpose in life is. You listen to your conscience. You realize that there are reasons, there are consequences for certain behaviors, and you adjust and you change that. And then he says those who cure by the power of faith, such as Christ and the apostles. But as we said last time when we talked about Éliphas Lévi, he calls it magic. It's not magic that's unexplained. It's based on the willpower, and it's based on the laws of nature. So if you really understand the laws of nature, then you will see that magic is not something that is unexplainable. Let's put it that way. I just thought I would bring this a little bit into the 21st century because there are two different systems of medicine. The one is the allopathic medicine. So here, this is the most common treatment. You have aims to combat disease by using remedies, such as drugs or surgery, which produce effects that are different from or incompatible with those of the disease being treated. And the other one, and that's why at least one biographer called him the spagyrist, Paracelsus. It's called spagyric. And that's an herbal medicine produced by alchemical procedures. These procedures involve fermentation, distillation, and extraction of mineral components from the ash of the plant. So you separate, you purify, and reunite. But you have to know what you're doing. For example, Bachblüten, Bach flowers are very common in Austria and Germany. You can people use them. I have never met anybody here, but I know that you can buy those at Whole Foods. Let's say you're working on a certain weakness. I have to learn patience in this life, for example. And so there are these drops called for treating impatience. You take just 4 drops and you drink that regularly. But at the same time, I mean, the drops alone don't help. You have to really focus and say, I would like to transmute this weakness. And in that book, I read, you have to use wild impatience to produce or make this essence. And I have wild impatience in my backyard, but oh my gosh, you have to cut them off at a certain time and only certain parts of the flower or the plant. And then you have to leave it in the sun and you have to treat it that the water has to be rainwater and purified. So it's very complicated, not as easy as we think. So his world edifice that he really, really tried to get through to his students was there are two parts. We have the visible, the tangible body, and we have the invisible and the imperceptible body, the astral body. He also taught them that heaven and earth are composed of three substances called sulfur, mercury, salt, and that there is no dead matter, which I mentioned when we talked about the minerals. But sulfur, mercury, and salt have nothing to do with the salt we eat or the sulfur. These are principles, right? And of the same three substances, the planets and all the stars consist. So sometimes he calls it substances, sometimes principles. I don't want to talk much about it because it's very complicated. A lot has been written about. I feel a lot has been misunderstood about it. But these three substances, they represent the spiritual and invisible principles of God, man, and the universe, which gave every object both its inner essence and outward form. They are of triune nature. That means salt. In salt, there's also contained sulfur and mercury, and the other way around. And the salt, the correspondence of the salt is the body. It represents the material parts of the body. Sulfur corresponds with the soul and represents the aura and energies. And mercury corresponds to the spirit and represents the fluid. If these three principles are in harmony, there is health. But there are many different layers. Remember when we talked about the fifth essence? It's this multidimensional thinking. And when it comes to those three substances, that's the same thing. People have to look at it at different levels. So this is what he always emphasized, right? The anatomy of the inner man. He says, if we know the anatomy of the inner man, we know the prima materia and may see the nature of the disease as well as the remedy. That which we see with our external eyes is the ultima materia. By dividing and dissecting the external body, we can learn nothing about the inner or the astral man. We merely destroy the unity of the whole. So that's what he emphasized. But he also said that the form reveals the essence. So the outer man is not completely unimportant. He said, for example, and I'm explaining this now in simple terms. This is it. He said, first, when you look at the man, you look at the feet and at the hands, right? Then you look at the face and at the head. And probably, he doesn't say it specifically, but yeah, there has to be some eye contact. And then you look at the shape of the body. And you know by that already a lot. And the fourth part is you look at the mannerism, right? At what background somebody has. For example, if you were to look at me, he might see that I have high cheekbones. And high cheekbones means that I have Slavic blood. And that's true because I am born in Austria, but my mother was Croatian. And I have a lot of not only features, but in the way I talk, I have a lot of Slavic. And this is important for him because he looked always at herbs in different regions. He said the herbs are not the same in one region compared to the other. He looked if the herbs were female or male, and that would make a difference. He actually already back then said, you don't treat men and women the same way. And when we think about it, you know, how long did they do research about heart attacks and the signs of heart attacks based on men? And only later did they realize that women don't show it, the same symptoms when they have a heart attack. So inner man, but also the features in the outer man. It was the climax of his career in Basel, but he had to leave. So what happened? So during this time, he once went on a trip with Zurich, and there were, I think maybe with students, and there were maybe lots of partying celebrations. And when he came back, first of all, Froben had died, and Froben had been his biggest supporter. And there was a hurtful lampoon. And he was really upset. It was somewhere in town where he saw that. And he wrote to the town council. And, the town council played an important role because, for example, the other professors were complaining that he was teaching in German or about his lectures, but the town council supported him and nothing happened. But the town council was not willing to do anything. And then there was another thing. So a nobleman with the last name of Lichtenfels, von Lichtenfels, he was well off, and he said he was very ill, and he tried different doctors, and he said, I will pay 100 gulden to whoever can treat me. And so Paracelsus went there, and he looked at him. He knew exactly what the problem was. He gave him a few pills. He gave him a list of things to do, and then he left. And then von Lichtenfels sent him 6 gulden, and he sent them back with a letter, and he said, you said you would pay 100 gulden. And Lichtenfels said, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, this was not the first time this happened to him. That really rich people said, if somebody can heal me, I'll pay you a lot. And then he did, and it didn't happen. Anyhow, so he was incensed. He was so upset. And he wrote to the town council, and the town council said, well, you gave him just a few pills and whatever, so 6 gulden should be enough. So he was very outspoken and very angry, which led to conflicts. And he was warned by one of his students, basically said, you need to leave Basel right now. And he left most of his things behind, and the student brought it to him afterwards because he would have been arrested. So what were these accusations by his opponents, or why were they so critical? Like, if you read some of these really mean biographies back then, it's not nowadays anymore, but back then, they all said he was a drunkard. But, first of all, he died, he was only 48, and he left a lot of information behind, so he couldn't have been drunk. And different biographers had different reasons for the statement. One said, for example, he wrote a letter once talking about the wine of wisdom and that they misinterpreted it. Another one said that water was not always healthy to drink. So sometimes people had to drink wine, maybe because of that. Or one person said that there was these celebrations in Zurich, and maybe this came from there. Doesn't matter. That was one. And they accused him of vanity and boasting. And there are, in some of the biographies, they have whole paragraphs. He was very upset. He did not hold back. He said that most physicians have no idea what they are doing. And in one book he wrote, to paraphrase, basically, none of you will be known. Your names will be forgotten. But what I taught, that will be known for a long time and appreciated. And he was right. But they didn't like that, right? He was very critical of ignorance and criticized not only the knowledge, but also the customs of other physicians. And he was blunt. He was very direct in his style of writing and what he said. I just wanted to say Ambrose Paré was a surgeon who was, I think, only 21 when Paracelsus passed away. And he read Greatest Surgery, one of the books. And he acknowledged and with admiration, he said that he learned so much from him and that his knowledge was impressive. So not everybody. So even during that time, he had his followers and he had his enemies. After this, endless wandering started, and there were also a lot of writings. So it makes no difference to mention all the places that he visited, but I had a few in red. Esslingen, for example. Esslingen I found interesting because he rented there a place with a cellar, and he must have had an alchemical laboratory there. There was a lot of smoke, and then later on, long time after he had passed away or had left and then passed away, the person who tried to sell this property found in the cellar astronomical writings and Rosicrucian symbols in the ceiling of this place. Sterzing had the plague. So he heard about that and he was not afraid, and he went to Sterzing and he helped the people that needed to be treated. There were a lot of people who passed away. And I also heard that he was the one who really kept the plague out of Switzerland. I don't know how much is true and what exactly he did, but I have heard that. And in Nuremberg, again, he arrived there. A lot of people admired him, came to him, he treated them. But then there were other doctors who criticized him. So he said, well, bring me somebody who nobody was able to heal. And so they brought him somebody with elephantitis, and he was able to help this person. Now, the writings, he wrote something called Opus Paramurum. He dedicated it to the physician Vadian, but he never acknowledged that, and that disappointed him deeply. He also wrote Astronomia Magna, his main philosophical work. And then he wrote and wanted to publish the Tracts on Syphilis and Paragranum, which is his main work on medical philosophy. But that was not happening. Why? Well, let's look at the reasons. So he really figured out how to treat syphilis. In the book, he described the illness, and he attacked the three main methods that were used at that time to heal this illness, right? First of all, people had to fast. Then they were internally and externally treated with quicksilver. And the third one, there was this fumigation of West Indian wood. It was called the Gaya treatment. He said that the disease could be successfully treated by carefully measured doses of mercury compounds taken internally. But what was the problem? Well, there was this family in Augsburg that made a lot of money importing that West Indian wood. And then there were other people who invested in that, and they made a lot of money. And when they read, because he said, forget this treatment, that does not heal anything, that doesn't help this illness. When they read that, they made sure and that happened then in the end in Nuremberg, that he was not allowed to publish this book and the next book. So the next book was this Paragranum. And I have a picture on the left. It's not this particular book, but it also shows he wrote here, it's the wrong way of doctors. So he was very outspoken about how mistaken the doctors were in the way they treated their patients. And back then, you see, most doctors didn't do surgeries, right? They said this is the barber's job, right? They just did bloodletting and prescribed some treatment, but they weren't helpful. And he really said it's a miracle that not more people died, because they probably kept with their treatments, kept them from naturally healing. Anyhow, he very structurally talked about the 4 pillars of medicine in this book. He said, a doctor has to know philosophy, the true perception and understanding of cause and effect, and a knowledge of physical nature. So he always emphasized, you have to understand the cause, otherwise you cannot heal. You have to understand nature, and you have to work with the laws of nature and not against them. He said that a doctor has to know astronomy, because he has to understand the astral influences and the knowledge of the powers of the mind. He has to know alchemy, a knowledge of the divine powers in men. That means all the powers that man had. But in addition, he has to his personal virtue. Because in the end, and he said that alchemy won't work if you are not a moral person. You have to purify yourself. You have to have pure motives if you want to help other human beings. He was able to publish one other book, Chirurgia Magna, and this first one mentioned here in Latin. But most of the writings were published after he had passed away, right? Also, one of the criticism was he one time said, I haven't read a book in 10 years. And so he was criticized for that, but it was clear why. Because he relied on observations, on personal experience, on intuition, and he studied the laws of nature. So that could not be found in the books that were written up till then. He did not write, I mean, there are a few things in his handwriting, but most of it was dictated to his students. And the first edition was the Huser edition of Paracelsus. Huser was an admirer of him, and he published the Paracelsus medical and natural philosophical works in Basel from 1589 till 1591, so years after Paracelsus had passed away, and it consisted of 10 volumes. Eventually, he stopped traveling around, and he ended up in Salzburg in Austria, and today's Austria. And he died in 1541, and he's actually buried in the churchyard of the San Sebastian church. But even about his death, there's mystery. It is not known, and there are many different reasons given. So some people say he experimented too much with quicksilver, and that caused his death. Some people said that he was assassinated or really attacked at a dinner, and then when he walked home, he fell and his skull was hurt, and then he died a few days later. So I think the way I see it is there can only be speculations, but there is a lot of interest. For example, at the University of Zurich, they created the Paracelsus project in order to research him more and to find out more about his life and get a better understanding of his teachings, because not everything is understood. And of course, back then, especially when it came to the alchemical writings, it was not clear. And maybe only somebody who is initiated into that knowledge will have the key to understand everything that he said. Now, he was born in Einsiedeln, and Einsiedeln, there's a nice monument, and you can see at the bottom, you have this stone, and there's a text on each side, and I picked this one. It says, "In memory of the doctor, naturalist and philosopher Theophrastus Paracelsus, innovator of medicine, father of chemotherapy, promoter of biology and wound medicine, savior of the spiritually neglected, herald of the medical ethos, idiosyncratic thinker and humble Christian, friend of the poor." Born at the end of 1493 next to the Teufelsbrücke am Etzel, he died after a Faustian life on September 24th, 1541 in Salzburg, remembering his home in Einsiedeln. So let's look now at Paracelsus and Theosophy. So as I said, Blavatsky wrote about him, and she said he was a great mind who had created a new mode of thinking on the natural existence of things. She mentioned him several times in Isis Unveiled, and I picked these three lines. So the first to discover and describe hydrogen, new element, and knew well all its properties and composition. I did read, though, by more than one biographer that was accidental. Still, he discovered this new element. He had studied astrology and astronomy, and he asserted that man is in a different affinity with the stars. She also said that Rosicrucians as alchemists became proverbial, and they gave birth to the more modern Theosophists, at whose head was Paracelsus. We looked last time at the constitution of man, and when I talked about the astral light, where is the level of the astral light and where is the akasha? Now, here we have on the right the principles that we teach in Theosophy. The principles by Paracelsus are very similar. They are not the same. Especially, I'm reading more about the mumia, which is explained as animal soul. But you can see here, he also talks about the elementary body instead of physical body, the astral body. He calls the archeos, the spiritus vitae, the mumia. Then he talks about the human soul, the rational soul, the flesh of Adam, and then the spiritual soul and the man of the new Olympus. But the new man of the new Olympus is Atma plus Buddhi plus Manas. The reason why I wanted to show this is because Franz Hartmann was a German theosophist, a contemporary of Blavatsky, one of my favorite writers. He wrote quite a few books in English, but most of them in German. And he wrote about Paracelsus, and you can find this on for free online. It is really very well done. And he said he is among those people who obtained their knowledge not merely from following the prescribed methods of learning or by accepting the opinions of the recognized authorities of their times, but they studied nature by her own light and becoming illuminated by the light of divine nature, who became lights themselves, whose rays illuminate the world of mind. He was a big admirer of Paracelsus. And he said, what they taught has been to a certain extent verified and amplified by the teachings of Eastern adepts, but many things about which the latter have to this day kept a well-guarded silence were revealed by Paracelsus 300 years ago. So it's very interesting. If you remember that for those who are newer to the Theosophical Society, it was founded in 1875, and it was Blavatsky who brought all these religions, traditions together into this one text, the Secret Doctrine. Before that, Isis Unveiled, but it's the Secret Doctrine mainly. And with that, really raised the interest of all these Eastern religions in the West. Anyhow, one important thing is the same as in Theosophy. He was talking about invisible creatures of the elements. So as he visited hermits, explored myths and legends by gypsies, alchemists, and herbalists, and he affirmed the reality of creatures in nature. He calls them elementals, but today we call them nature spirits. So for fire, it's not salamanders, earth, gnomes, water, undines, air, sylphs. And he said they consisted of a subtle principle, one principle. And mainly he loved this topic because I heard him talk more than once. There are recordings on YouTube. The quality is not good, but mainly Hall was a great speaker. But what is so important, and I want to mention that because it has something to do with the epidemics he talks about. He also talks about elementaries, which were adapted from writings of the Egyptians and other nations. Leadbeater wrote about those too in his book, Astral Plane, which you can find also for free online. Elementaries are artificial beings created by man himself. They are negative psychic formations, and they're nourished by the continual repetition of the attitudes which cause them. This is so important to understand because, for example, let's assume somebody has a bad temper, but the more often that person loses his temper, the easier it becomes to do because he creates these elementaries and they are attached to him. So if you were a clairvoyant, you would see maybe all these, little, it looks maybe like insects attached to this body and strengthen that temper. Or if you are a hateful person, there is this etheric sea of hate in the astral light. Remember, that's the dregs of the Akasha. And he would align himself with the storehouse of anger in the astral light. And that anger becomes larger and larger. And then, everything works like a magnet. Then you attract other people who are hateful. And that can cause problems. And these elementaries can only exist within the energy field of their creators. But if you think about it, I am sure that all of us have experienced that we meet a person and we are just caught off guard because there's so much negative energy. So this is thought forms, and thought forms become manifested. And we have to learn to change them, transmute them if we have anything like a bad temper or hatefulness. And because he also says good thoughts and right emotions attract then the guardian angels. So we really have to not watch our actions. We have to watch our thoughts because they can manifest. He also emphasized that we are responsible for our use of energy. We have to respect life around us. We have to dedicate our skills to the service of those in need. We can transmute our body and our being. And we have to understand that food is a medium for the transmissions of life force. Thus, nutrition is important. That was in the 15th century. He also liked Éliphas Lévi, but of course, Éliphas Lévi studied Paracelsus. He said, will, love, and imagination. He always emphasized imagination, how important that is, are magic powers that everyone possesses, and he who knows how to develop them and to use them consciously and effectually is a magician. And he also says he who uses them for good purposes practices white magic. If it's for bad or selfish purposes, it's black magic. And he makes a distinction between magic and sorcery, because sorcery deals with the forces of the human and animal soul, but magic was the supreme power of the spirit. He had a natural affinity with the Hermetic philosophy, like as above, so below, but also the Neoplatonists. So he believed that sickness and health in the body relied upon the harmony of humans and nature, right? He was very religious. And the purpose of science is not only to learn more about the world around us, but also to search for divine signs and potentially understand the nature of God. He knew astrology and astronomy and contributed substantially to the rise of modern medicine, including psychiatric treatment. So even bacteria and viruses, he said they're psychic entities created by man. His work, Die große Wunderarznei, is a forerunner of antisepsis. He already understood back then the powers of mineral springs, which we are using still to this day. He clearly expounded the concept of dose response, because back then they thought, well, the more the better, but this is not always true, or rarely. He was the father of modern toxicology and precursor of chemical pharmacology and therapeutics. So these are my concluding comments. He was venerated by German Rosicrucians. Carl Jung studied him. His knowledge was sustained two ways, by experience and intuition. He pointed us to the importance of the thought forms. Poet Lessing said, "Those who imagine that the medicine of Paracelsus is a system of superstitions will, if they once learn to know its principles, be surprised to find that it is based on a superior kind of knowledge, which we have not yet attained, but into which we may hope to grow." He also, and that will be next week, talked about magnets. He's not that much known for that. It's Franz Anton Mesmer. He explained in his writings the therapeutic powers of the magnet. He knew the powers of mineral, human, and astral magnetism. He said the magnet is especially useful in all inflammations, in fluxes and ulcerations, and diseases of the bowels and the uterus, in internal as well as in external diseases. And he said the magnet has a front, the north pole, and the back, the south pole, and the former attracts and the later repulses. And he said the manner of employing a magnet changes according as to whether one wishes to draw the diseased aura out of the body or to cause it to be reabsorbed into its center. Paracelsus is a huge topic. One could create more than one course about him. So I pulled out the information that I thought was relevant. There is, like in Switzerland, for example, there's a magazine, Paracelsus, and there is a English-speaking magazine too that has great information, great articles, and the emphasis is on alternative medicine. And in Switzerland, this organization also, you can take classes, you can get courses there. I have heard a Swiss doctor talk, why is the emphasis suddenly more about Paracelsus today? And the reason is that it's not only in the United States, also in Europe, rely too much on pills. And we do not understand how important or how useful herbs and plants can be. I just want to say as a final thing, Arthur Schopenhauer said, all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, is accepted as self-evident. And I hope that we will reach that state with all of the teachings of Paracelsus one day, that it is self-evident. And that we'll find the key to all these alchemical writings. But it might be several lifetimes.